So, hi everyone. I'm here with Chris Hague today, and he's the SVP of Bill Gosling Outsourcing. So, obviously in the outsourcing space, the BPO space, and in the collections and arrears management space as well. So Chris, thanks very much for joining me. Really appreciate it.
No problem at all.
So, we've had a lot of great conversations over the last couple of years, really, around AI, and we've both watched with interest how AI has developed and then permeated throughout all of the different processes we've got. I mean, what do you think the current status of AI is now, and where do you think we currently stand? I mean, we've seen it develop massively.
100%. I think it depends on who you talk to nowadays. And I think one of the biggest challenges is how different people define what AI actually is. So I think there's a contextual piece to where it currently sits
Mm,
that depending on who you ask, some people will view AI when I might view it more as it's an RPA type process as opposed to
mm,
AI. But fundamentally, it has developed and changed, especially over the last couple of years. I think the evolution to sort of a true AGI still feels a way off, but I don't think it's a way off in the context as it was of sort of the nascent period of the internet coming online. I think you're probably looking at 5 to 10 years maybe before I think there'll be that evolutionary shift in what the capability of it is, because it seems to me that we're still in the early building block phases of the test and learn sort of structure of how this is developing out. But the speed of change is phenomenal. So, things I've looked at 6 months ago, the improvement in some of these products within even that short period of time is almost night and day.
I mean, it's been interesting from an ops point of view, as you say. I mean, we were very focused on robotic process automation, and it was like digital process
Yes.
design. How do we automate that? How do you make that digital? Those kind of things. And it just feels like the last sort of 12, 18 months ago, we've got this almost like extra layer of complexity, particularly with the LLM models that have come in that allow us to do almost like, remember fuzzy logic?
Yes, I
They
do.
allowed us to do fuzzy logic. I mean, how much of an enabler do you think that is, particularly from an ops point of view, to just up the amount of automation or the amount of digital interaction that we can now have? I mean, is that been a game changer, or is that just like the next level?
We can already see huge developments in the level of relatively straightforward, almost call them non-complex tasks being automated. And I think you can see that across operations, whether it's within an internal structured process or even if it's customer facing. That degree of automation is already self-evident. And that can be looking at it from a recruitment perspective and just things like managing CVs, and what used to be a
Mm,
manual process, you can now pretty much automate the entire sifting through, the prioritization off the back of it, so that you still have the human element of a final review. And I know that we implemented this about 18 months ago, and lots of checks and balances to make sure it was working appropriately. And now that's used widespread with regards to how we narrow the pool down from
mm,
potentially thousands of CVs to a much smaller, more manageable number, where you then get the human oversight or the review off the back of it. The outputs from that can be scored, can be prioritized based on whatever criteria you want to build into it. That degree of automation, I think, just exists. And I almost take that as a
mm,
given at the moment. I think there's still a degree of how much AI is very well dressed up, almost pre-programmed workflows versus truly autonomous AI.
mm.
And I still think there's a degree of change still to come in that area, because I think it goes back to what I said about, the context of what people believe AI actually is has been significant. And what is currently being worked on, either by ourselves or by others across various different industries, I think is the next huge step.
Do you think that the teams have the right mindset? So we're almost like, because there is definitely a mindset to thinking around how do we automate a process? And that's in terms of process design. How can we incorporate these new large language model type thinking within our processes and link that into our process? How far evolved do you think, or awareness is there in terms of the capabilities of these and then the readiness to then roll that out into processes? Has that been a challenge for you guys? How do you approach that? Because that sits culturally within the teams as much as just the actual technology itself.
So we've approached it by having people dedicated to working on
Mm,
transformation in these areas. But it filters down from the top with regards to culturally and directionally, which way are you looking at your business evolving? And are you going to commit the time and effort into making sure you've got the right people in the right seat to actually deliver,
mm,
and they have the knowledge, the skills, and the background to not only drive these things forward, but engage others down throughout the organization? One, to understand it, and also to buy into it, and to slightly, I guess, adjust or adapt what might have been more traditional ways of thinking into what a future way of thinking needs to be. And it doesn't happen overnight. And I think it does take time and effort, but it has to be embedded across all the layers of the organization, because quite often we've found that some of the best ideas have come from people working at the coalface,
mm,
who, once you've sort of explained what direction we want to try and do with the business or how we're wanting to look to improve it, they'll come up with scenarios of, it would be really good if we could change this element. Is there a way that we could, because that's a really repetitive task that I don't feel I'm really adding any value doing that. It's
mm.
just I'm going through the motions. So the identification of those areas has been just as critical as having the mindset to actually go
Yeah.
after them.
I mean, the recent swathe of AI that's been implemented is a bit like the invention of the car, I kind of see in some ways, which is before we had the car, we were walking everywhere, let's say, and then we invented the car, and then we had this capability to basically cut down on the journey time. But once we understood what the car could do, then there are other uses that came up, such as delivery drivers or those sorts of things. But it was a wider understanding around what the capability was to then work out these other use cases. And it feels like we might be on the same kind of journey, and it's around having the whole of the organization understanding what the capability is to then really maximize coming up with all the different use cases.
Yes, the way that we've approached it is looking at what's the test and learn scenario we want to pick up first. And then
Mm,
before we go and do anything with it, we'll have assessed it and evaluated and run various sort of test programming on it within something that may be quite narrow in its initial scope, just to make sure it does what it says on the tin and what we're looking to achieve off the back of it. I think it's quite easy to almost sit down and map out, we could do all of these things across all of these different functions, but you've then got to take a step back and go, but where is the priority and why? And
mm,
is it about operational efficiency? Is it about the customer experience and the customer satisfaction? How does that blend in with the AI and the human engagement? So you've got the artificial intelligence as much as you've got the human intelligence. If you, given the totality of knowledge that we have, would it be able to come up with Einstein's theory of relativity that he did just in his
mm,
own head in 1900? And the answer is
mm,
no. Leverage it to the best of its potential today, as well as having one eye on how is it morphing and changing and what might that mean in the future. I think the hardest thing is trying to figure out what time period the future actually is, because there's certain scenarios where I see the future almost as being 6 to 12 months away, in which case, well, you need to be sort of doing it now because it'll be there tomorrow.
and the pace of change has just been huge, hasn't it? The speed at which things are changing and the speed at which you come up with an idea and then it almost gets superseded. The leapfrog effect in terms of the ideas moving forward is just incredible.
And how things are structured. So I was talking to somebody recently who they've got sort of an agentic AI chatbot.
Mm,
And a few months ago, there were elements of latency issues in it. It was partly linked to the LLM and how it was all structured in the background. So they quite creatively looked at, well, one of the ways we can address that is, instead of it just being one single LLM for everything, we can chunk this into smaller models for different bits of that conversation. And then for the complex bit, maybe we'll have the LLM. And in 6 to 9 months, the difference in how that product works is quite marked. The latency almost seems to have disappeared. So the technology was always there. It's almost the strategic use of it and how it's adapted to address some of those, what at the time were not so much problems, but it just didn't have a good customer experience feel to it.
Yeah.
And yet now that I wouldn't have the same perception listening to it today.
I mean, I know that you've been an advocate of AI and sort of very in a pragmatic kind of way, but I think it's interesting how just generally the thinking around AI, particularly there's a lot of fear around AI when it first came up, particularly the LLMs when they first came up.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting how that conversation seems to have changed over the last couple of years. So we've gone from you must always speak with an agent at all times, and there was legislation being put through to sort of protect us from AI. And if you look at where we are today, it kind of feels like it's popping up everywhere. It pops up on my Amazon account, it pops up on all my chat accounts, everywhere. And it's kind of like, well, I'm going to ask AI, the LLM, the question because it gets me to the answer quicker. Do you see that, I suppose, with your clients, and then what their clients or they're saying about their customers as well? I mean, do you think it's just a matter of human evolution and we're just now more accepting of it because we're fearing it less?
So I can answer that on both ends of the spectrum. So yes, I do think we're generally, as a population, becoming more accepting of it. I think we always seem to struggle with change. There's a nervousness that comes with it because it's, for the majority of people, it's the vast unknown. And I think from a client's perspective, the majority of the clients that you'll sort of go and look at, they will already have a version of some AI within their infrastructure. The concern that, rightly so, they have is about protecting their customer data. So there is still this question of, well, how do you address that concern? Because they can get comfortable with how they're doing it themselves internally because they have that direct control over what happens to it and where it goes. When it's then one step removed into a supplier or somebody doing something on their behalf, it then raises that spectre of, well, what is happening to our customer data? So I think you have to get them comfortable that the risks are being appropriately managed and controlled. I think some are still very nervous about internet-linked LLMs, are looking for how can you actually do this in a way that it's not the full internet linked, and maybe you're doing it through sort of privately structured models, which you can get the controls with those, but you don't necessarily get the same speed of innovation and the latest versions of models and algorithms being accessible. Takes more time and effort to manage them. So I do think it depends on the risk appetite of the individual client as to where they sit on that spectrum. I think as from a user's perspective, I think the challenge will be if something wide scale happens from the sort of the spam, phishing, the scam side of things. If something like that happens, then I think it might take a knock with regards to engagement levels, because you may get people automatically presuming the negative. So I think the more companies can approach it with a risk management mindset, then the more comfort you can give to clients or to yourselves as a user of the products yourself that you design. And I think there's a generational piece with the end users where I think sort of the younger you are, the more you have grown up with these types of tools, that they're second nature. It doesn't even cross your mind that there's anything to really think about. Whereas for, I guess, myself and the generation where the mobile phone didn't exist when I was growing up, through to this, it feels like you're living through a version of Star Trek where, what we've managed to go through in our lifespan. So I think that is where you sometimes get more reticence sometimes to engage. And I think the interesting question will be whether all of the advantages you can get from it with a much speedier resolution, you don't have AHT issues if you're waiting to have it, got all of the available knowledge potentially to answer the questions, even though you might want to limit it and have it still tip out into a human agent at a certain point. Whether you can get customers, because people engage with IVRs now, not everybody, but they do. And if you shrink it down to its almost lowest common denominator of it's a clever AI for some of these bots that you're looking at, I don't think that's a leap for many of them. I think there's a question mark around, do you make it obvious it's AI, or is the sort of the language so slick that it's difficult to tell the difference? Because I think that is maybe an ethical question as to whether people believe it's a human or not. But I think it's going to be the engagement that you see from that, which is almost going to be the self-fulfilling prophecy of how it can look to develop over time.
I suppose there's a fundamental question there around what's the reason for the contact? What's the reason for the call, right? If the reason
100%.
for the call is I need to get something done, or I need to,
Yep.
I've got a query and it's very sort of transactional focused, then I would absolutely talk with an AI, because if it means that I don't have to then wait in queue, as an example, just using telephone, or the same with text. If the purpose of my call is to be listened to, and to have a conversation with a human, then it's not. So thinking about vulnerability type calls or calls with people in vulnerable situations. And it's almost like both of those are in the same box at the moment, aren't they? And it's like, how do you separate those? Because one part of me would say, well, absolutely I would. And the other part of me would say no.
And I think this comes down to the programming and the sophistication of the models to identify language or just the tonality of that conversation to say, look, we're going to actually pass you over to our such and such team. And you can actually proactively try and push it into the humans. And I think that is something that whenever I've had conversations with clients, that's one of their concerns, that it doesn't become just a pure operational efficiency call. And actually it's there because the customer is driving the reason for the engagement of that tool. And it's actually providing an improvement in service, as opposed to it's just a way of using technology versus human. And I think the balance is going to be when you can structure that so that, to your point, the generic can be picked up and answered. I think there will always need to be an exit point where you're going to need to go to the human agent who has got the empathy, the experience, just the human experience that goes with it, to be able to better manage that call than you're going to be able to get from AI.
So I'm also interested in new functionality as well. So I'm thinking about dial transfers there in particular, which is when you have to talk to multiple people, different expertise.
Yep.
And now you won't need to do that, because you'll be able to just do it with one particular contact, because the person's got almost like a super agent. They understand everything across multiple areas, which
Yes.
that's another kind of interesting kind of areas, or that's new functionality that wasn't available before.
Yes. I think that's an inevitability that they will come up. But I still think the way that you are going to get either the customer as the end user or the client that you're working for, or even if it's companies doing it for themselves, I still think you're going to be ending up with this blend of the technology and the human, because there is still a risk attached to it. It's, especially if it's internet linked large, you're always going to have the risk of hallucinations. You're always going to have the risk of well-intentioned responses maybe being sent back from something that don't actually work in the real world from the context. And there are articles that you can read where those types of scenarios that have happened, where vulnerability, you get the sort of the extreme cases of where somebody's really depressed and they're not knowing what to do, and they suggest something, and then the AI goes, well, yes, that sounds like a good idea, and you're like, no, it's not. That's a really bad idea.
Mm.
But it's the context of how it's interpreted, the language, and I think that's why we're still a long way off certain areas having anybody, I would hope,
Yeah.
comfortable in having AI cover it off.
You mentioned something earlier about deployment, and it's around not using internet models and using local models. And this has come up elsewhere in terms of consistency of models and consistency of output as well. So if you use an internet model, then they change the model in the background. Does that now give you a different output for the same inputs? I mean, those kind of things. Even if it's not hallucinations, it just gives you something different.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
mean, do you think we're going to have not only just like local models so they can be consistent against clients, but almost like client-based models? So it's the same model, because you don't want to be able to ask about one client and then be able to bleed over the information to another client. So do you think we'll see these ring-fence multiple models being held within vendors? So you'll run not just one model, one large model, but you'll actually have a ring-fence model or 10 different models for a particular location for 10 different clients?
I think it's a distinct possibility, because if you just look at the way that different clients operate today with regards to the policies or the processes or their interpretations of different things, there's a high degree of consistency, because ultimately they if you take financial services, they all fall under the same regulator.
Mm.
But their interpretation and their comfort levels of different things within that can actually lead to quite a variance in how you may treat a certain type of
Mm.
customer scenario. So it's not going to be a one size fits all now. And if whether that needs to be structured in separate models, or whether the models can be made sophisticated enough so that they can identify it's client A versus client B, therefore I need to interpret it in a slightly different way for the response. That's where you need far cleverer people than me to answer the question of how it actually gets constructed. But the principle of what you're talking about, yes, I do think there will be a degree of that required, because there's that degree of uniqueness across the client base that exists today.
The other thing you're making me think of is just like we have penetration testing for things like fraud and those kind of things
Yep.
on our existing systems, is will we have prompt testing that comes up for these models, particularly where it's customer interactions? And it's been quite interesting where some of the the internet-based models, they've tried to put controls in place so you can't ask about topics you shouldn't
Yes.
be asking about, those kind of things. But there's a whole army of people that seem to be like designing prompts to try and work around that. And I just wonder if that's a potential exposure for, at least for the financial services industry, to work out, are customers trying to work around that to get information maybe they shouldn't as well? And so that's probably something we've got to think about.
100%. And I think this is why at the moment there is a far greater acceptance of having local models
Mm.
for people to be prepared to have further conversations with, than having the full sort of open model version, because it's the control element.
Mm.
And yes, from day dot, they've adapted different models. They restricted it from being able to ask it how it felt about certain things, because it started answering, and
Yeah.
I think it scared the bejesus out of various different tech analysts who were running it. I think those are the questions that, as a broad industry, and I mean that in the sense of everybody involved in how these products are developed and the technology behind them, those are part of how we have to structure the approach that we take with this, because the clients are going to think about that, but the customers are going to think about that.
Mm.
You've got to be able to trust what you're being told, whether that's being by a human or whether it's by AI. And I think the risk is always, if you lose that, it's so difficult to get it back.
Mm.
And that's not just the reputational risk that goes with a client or something that we may do as a business. It's that broader risk of, I'm not going to trust AI again because what it told me was nonsense. Or so I do think there's still more to be done in that forward thinking phase of, how do we control it? How can it be structured in a way that customers are protected and clients are protected, that it is giving us the outcomes and the responses that we are expecting to see? And I think that's a process that's ongoing. I don't
Mm.
think that's, it's not certainly not been nailed yet from what I
And
consider.
And I suppose almost we've got a frontier around sort of like then we got the future as well. I suppose up to that sort of frontier, I mean, what do you think the best use cases are now? And it feels like the frontier is almost like that customer interaction piece. I mean, there's back office stuff that we can do now, and we're talking about HR and those kind of things. I mean,
Yeah,
what do you think the strongest use cases are today? And then we'll talk a bit about where you think it'll go in the future.
probably the strongest I'm seeing right now is some of the agentic AI tools that are being brought out. So looked into quite a few of those. Definitely, there's been a massive improvement over the last short number of months in the capabilities. I think whenever I'm talking to people or they're doing demos, then I'll ask them to make it as human-like as it can be in interactions, interrupt the model while it's in the middle of talking, because I want to see how it reacts. And is there a massive degree of latency, or how does it react to it? Sometimes don't interrupt it with a question, just interrupt it. To stop the flow. It's those bits that give me a flavor for how much more sophisticated some of these models have become over recent time. And that's been fascinating to see. Self-service engagement side, that again, from a generational perspective, I do think there's people who are now coming into sort of the marketplace, if you want to look at that, sort of 18 and maybe sort of late 20s, that they're quite happy doing everything self-serve. So to them, it's not a stress to just, I'm chatting away to some kind of AI and it's giving me the answers that I want really quickly. Thanks very much. Goodbye. So I think the agentic AI is probably where we're at right now for how does that leverage a better customer experience than maybe some firms are capable of delivering today, because it can reduce your AHTs. It can take the more simplistic versions of queries and answer them straight away, but still allow you to opt out of that flow path, for want of a better phrasing, into talking to a human agent.
Where do you think this sort of leaves the BPO industry? I mean, from that point of view, we talked a lot about automation and how do we sort of like improve customer service, those kind of things. But there's also, I mean, obviously people outsource to BPOs to try and get some of this extra capability. I mean, where do you think that sort of like changes the industry and sort of leaves the industry in terms of, both particularly from a price per seat model, but how is that going to sort of evolve, and the industry, how does the industry kind of need to stay ahead?
I think you can look at it in quite a few different ways. So you've got at the moment, you talked on the cost per seat model. Does that morph into a cost per outcome model? Does it actually drive out other shifts within the broader industry of what good looks like, and actually how you can deliver the degree and the quality of service that people want for their customer base in as timely a fashion as possible? And yes, obviously they want it being done cost effectively too. I still think you've got the question mark around the end users. If you take a very probably crude version, but Morrison's as a supermarket, they've actually backed out a lot of their self-service tills because their customers don't like them. So that's an example of where it's reversed some of its, I mean, I'm talking basic automation, but it's reversed because the customer base has turned around and said, no, we don't want to be doing this for ourselves. We like the fact that we're going and talking to whoever's sitting on the till and bagging these groceries up. And I think that's still the slight unknown, is what do we, as sort of human consumers, what do we want that experience to be like? And where do we potentially maybe draw a line? And is that different for different industry verticals or different processes within those industry verticals? So I think the evolution for the BPO industry is, it's more of the same. It's never stopped changing. It's constantly evolving. Even if I just think the rate of change is fundamentally changing.
It does always feel like the BPO industry, I mean, it's like they're paid to stay ahead. I mean, versus a client who's got, product to worry about, they've got other operational things to worry about, and you guys sort of worry about the outsourcing piece or the customer contact piece or those kind of things. And so you invest in that. So you sort of stay ahead sort of making a name by staying ahead. It's kind of more of the same to a certain extent, because you're giving capability that often clients can't necessarily get as quickly.
Yes, in a nutshell,
Yeah.
because to your point, yeah, they will have multiple different priorities internally, which could be from, customer acquisition. When I used to work in banking, it was always collections and recoveries was the poor cousin of marketing and sales
Mm.
until markets shifted, and then all of a sudden
Yeah.
all the focus went to the back end again.
Yeah.
But that sort of life cycle exists across every single industry type. You've always got those conflicting challenges. Whereas for the BPO industry, whether it's telephony based, whether it's back office, whether it's customer experience, customer support, customer services versus collections and recoveries, first party, third party, all of those are still going to be focused in one way or another on how can we improve our capabilities for the clients in a way that they are going to be comfortable with, that de-risks their concerns around data privacy, data security. That sort of balance is where our focus has to be, to make sure that we can provide the services that people want, regardless of how it's structured, at a price point that makes sense for them.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating to see sort of like how it evolves, and it kind of makes sense. So as we talked about the line, I mean, what are the ideas that you think we haven't come across yet, or you're talking about, or get excited about in terms of where some of this capability could take the industry?
I think if I knew that,
As
I'd
much
probably
as
be
we know.
investing in certain companies right now, and I'll happily retire at some point. I think there's still some almost bigger existential questions of how far are we prepared to go with the automation and the autonomous running of AI. If you overlay that with sort of the advancements in robotics and what that might mean for certain job markets, somebody, I can't remember whether I read it or somebody said it to me not that long ago. Are we going to turn around in a few years and realize that we've fundamentally undervalued manual labor for the last 50 to 100 years? And actually, the electricians and the plumbers are going to be the ones that are the career paths for people to go down, because a lot of other roles are AI assisted, much more so than those roles necessarily are. But there's also a question mark whether it changed the globalized economy. There's a lot of offshoring that is partially, at least, price point driven. If you are able to leverage AI to do portions of that work stream, does that change that mix? I think there's a rebalancing of, instead of needing to require 500 people to take on a new client to do all these multiple work streams, maybe that growth comes with 200 people or whatever the number might be, because actually there is a healthy percentage that you are able to manage through AI. The next 5 years for me is going to be how quickly the technology evolves. And we've sort of briefly touched on how much it's changed in the last short number of months, how quickly that evolves, how quickly true AGI comes into play more mainstream and with use cases. And then the bigger piece is, even if it exists, are clients going to allow you to leverage it in the way that is going to allow you to maximize its full potential? And as a sort of wider societal piece, what does that mean for the wider society and the control and the flow of that data and information and where it's held? I think you touched on it, you call it almost the frontier. There is almost this frontier land that we're still going to be walking through, I think, over the next short number of years.
I mean, being in the frontier, or sort of talking about the frontier piece, is very exciting because you get all these different ideas. I suppose the realities is walking through it is often a bit messy, isn't it? So we're like, some things work, some things don't, and it can be a bit frustrating if you want everything to be easy. But it is interesting. It's fascinating to see how it's going to change over the next couple of years, for sure.
Absolutely. And I think that's why the control piece comes in, because it is going to be messy, and you have to, you'll learn from the mistakes more than you'll learn from the successes. And I think it's having that mindset to improve, but doing it in a structured way where there's a tangible value add that you're going to get from the back end of it that people are going to engage with and clients are going to want to employ.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. Well, Chris, thanks very much for making the time. I really appreciate it. It's a fascinating
Most
topic.
welcome.
I know we've had a few conversations on it, and I love each of our conversations. It's really good. We always end up going down different rabbit holes. So I enjoy chatting about that frontier piece as well. So,
Yeah,
so Chris, thanks very much. Really appreciate making the time.
no problem at all, Chris. All right.
Thanks.
Thank you now.
Thanks. Bye.
Cheers.